If your pH is higher than 6.5, you got too much of something. And he said, if you have too much of something, you're going to have too little of something else. If you did a soil test that said you didn't need anything, and you believed it because we're making 50 bushel, everybody else is making 30 bushel. But then the second year, it didn't make 50 bushel, made 40. Soil test still said you didn't need anything. Third year, it made 30. Soil test still said you didn't need anything, and after that, it just kept on making 30. But the soil test never showed what difference. Why aren't we still making 40 or 50? I ask, I don't know how many people that question. Well, I would ask one after another, people that were there, agronomists and so forth. Well, why did that happen? Oh, I don't know.
We're going beyond NPK and diving deep into the blueprint of the earth itself. Please welcome to the show the soil architect himself, Neal Kinsey.
Good morning, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
You know, to start with, at the end of the day, Neal, I know you worked with Charles Walters, correct? Throughout a lot of your career. And, you know, if you can maybe just give us a little bit of a brief overview of that work that you had with Charles Walters, yourself, and then really the influence of Dr. William Albrecht on that work, if you could.
Well, in terms of Charles Walters, I first met him at a ranch called the AC Ranch in Big Sandy, Texas, back around 1971. And I was business manager of that ranch, and it was an all-natural ranch. It was not certified organic or anything else, but every material that was used on that ranch was from a natural source. And they had 2 beef herds, certified Hereford and certified Angus, a certified brown Swiss dairy, and a slaughterhouse.
Okay.
And he had heard that this was being done. He came down to do an interview for what was just starting out, Acres USA newspaper. And I had the job of showing him around. Well, we got to know one another. And then before you know it, they had the First Acres conference in Kansas City, and he invited us to come up to that. So that's how I originally got to know Charles Walters. And from then on, it was just a matter that his interests and our interests were quite well coordinated. Now, when I first went to the Acres conference, I was like a fly on the wall. I just got over to the side because all these famous people were there, and all I wanted to do was absorb what they knew to do. It was a little different back then because you only had one speaker at a time, and the room was full and standing room, and then you go out in the hallway and hear everybody discussing it. So it wasn't hard to meet everyone. As far as that, over the years, Charles would have me do articles for the paper or ask me certain questions and have me answer questions for people that would contact him. So that's how I got to know him. And
Sure.
Over time, it's come to find out he had studied the same things under Dr. Albrecht that I'd studied. So we could talk each other's language.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As a result, then, finally he kept asking me about writing a book, and I said, maybe if I ever retire, maybe I'll have time to do that. But I said, otherwise, I don't have time to do it. So he said, well, what if we put some things together?
Yeah.
And you and I work together on this, and we'll get that done. So if it hadn't been for Charles Walters, Hands-On Agronomy would not be here today. As for the association with Dr. Albrecht,
Gotcha.
I actually knew Dr. Albrecht before I knew Charles Walters because I was at University of Missouri back in 1966 to 68. And that's where I got acquainted with Dr. Albrecht.
Sure.
And the reason being, I didn't know who Dr. Albrecht was. Honestly, I don't believe I'd ever heard his name. But he'd been retired from teaching. He was professor emeritus of soils at University of Missouri. But he hadn't been teaching since 1958. That's when he actually stepped down. He'd been there 40 years from 1918 to 1958. But when I was there in 1966 through 68, he was in his office every morning. He would come in and he didn't sit there and twiddle his thumbs. If you wanted to talk to Dr. Albrecht, you generally had to call to make an appointment, and it would probably be 2 weeks or more before you'd get in because he had that many people still coming after 10 years, still coming to discuss agriculture with him. That's how well known he was. And
wow, that's amazing. That's amazing, and then it's exciting to see that you actually knew him personally when you were there at the university.
I have
that's
to say,
an exciting
he's the one
thing.
that was responsible for changing the direction I was looking at, because I had asked, I don't know how many people. I grew up on farms in southeast Missouri, and the main soil that we had was heavy black sharky clay, the old sticky gumbo. And on the farms, we thought we were doing a great job when we'd take some old swampland and get all the scrub timber off and drain it, plant it in soybeans. Well, the first year you planted it in soybeans, it'd make 50 bushel. Nobody was making 50 bushel that were growing soybeans around us. Nobody except the ones who were clearing out the old swampland, and they'd make it 1 year. And if you did a soil test that said you didn't need anything, and you believed it because we're making 50 bushel, everybody else is making 30 bushel. But then the second year, it didn't make 50 bushel, made 40. So it just still said you didn't need anything. Third year, it made 30. So it still said you didn't need anything. And after that, it just kept on making 30. But the soil test never showed what difference. Why aren't we still making 40 or 50? I asked, I don't know how many people that question. Sure. Even after I was there at University of Missouri, I was there 66 to 68, and actually was looking into food industry logistics to move what was produced around. And
and thank God that didn't happen. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well,
right.
I would ask one after another, people that were there, agronomists and so forth. Well, why did that happen? Oh, sure. I don't know. And finally, one young fellow said, "Why don't you go ask Dr. William Albrecht? If anybody knows the answer, he would." Well, if it hadn't been for that guy, I wouldn't have known to even go to see Dr. Albrecht. And I was a grad student and working on a master's, and I had a office on the second floor of Mumford Hall, which was where the econ department was. Turns out the soil department was on the first floor of Mumford Hall. When I went in the morning and turned to the left to go up the steps, if I'd turned to the right, there was Dr. Albrecht's office. He was right there. So I just went in, talked to the secretary, and made an appointment for a couple of weeks later or whatever. Went in and explained that to him, and he shook his head. She said, "Neal, I am familiar with the area that you're talking about. I did a lot of work down there when I first started looking at soils and so forth." And he said, "Before I answer your question, I want to know a little bit about what your experience is. What about your family?" Well, my grandfathers have both been farmers and in southeast Missouri, basically. And he said, "Well, your grandfather, one had died one died when my dad was 12 years old, so I didn't know that grandfather. But the one I do," he said, "Well, what was his main cash crop?" I said, "Well, alfalfa." Well, he shook his head yes, and he said, "Yep." He said, "And what happened?" I said, "Well, by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I can remember riding around with my grandpa, and he'd look at the alfalfa fields because back then, the river flooded every year and seepwater would come out and get on the whole farm. I mean, it would just cover a big portion of the farm was covered with water. And then by April or so, generally that seepwater would all seep back into the river and you could go ahead and farm. Well, on the higher ground, he put alfalfa there, but he'd drive around in the alfalfa because we'd have seepwater there too. And he'd watch the low places. And when those low places started to get curly dock or sour dock in them, he'd say, "Well, when this alfalfa stand plays out, we'll plant soybeans there because we can make more money out of soybeans than alfalfa now." And he used those weeds to tell him. Dr. Albrecht sitting there shaking his head. And he said, "Now, Neal, if your grandfather and your father had known what I'm going to tell you now, alfalfa could still be their major cash crop." Well, by the time I met by the time I graduated from high school, when I was 8 years old, every county in southeast Missouri had at least one alfalfa mill. Some of them had two. There was that much alfalfa grown here. But by the time I graduated from high school, there was only one in the whole of southeast Missouri. All the rest of them had shut down because people quit growing alfalfa. It just wasn't profitable enough. So he said, if they had known this, alfalfa could still be their major cash crop. And he said, the problem is you didn't do a good enough soil test. Maybe he said accurate or whatever, but anyhow.
Gotcha.
I said, but we used the soil test from the University of Missouri. And he said, and what was on it? Yeah. Well, pH, phosphorus, and potassium. And he shook his head, yes. He said, and do you know why you got that soil test? Well, I mean, I just always thought it was because we needed to have a soil test. He said, the reason you got that soil test was it didn't cost anything. It was free. He said, you do a free soil test?
Yeah,
well,
which
unless the farmer knows something. And he said that soil test didn't tell you what you needed to know. He said the soil test itself could have told you what was happening if you had done a complete analysis. But he said the problem is, and he asked me, he said, what was your soil pHs? And I said, well, 7.3 or 7.4. That's what they generally always be. Well, with a pH like that, you're always told you don't need any lime. And we believed it. pH was so high. Well, he said, Neal, when you have a high pH, if your pH is higher than 6.5, you got too much of something. And he said, if you have too much of something, you're going to have too little of something else. You've got to find out what you need and start supplying that. And once you find out what's lacking and start to supply that, that's the real key to getting the yields up and keeping the yields up. And he said, what's that? He said, what I'm going to tell you is your soil may have a high pH, but he said, I know those soils and they are deficient in calcium and potassium. Well, that was a surprise to me because our soils there had 600, 700, 800 pounds of potassium to the acre. But he was saying they were deficient. Well, he said, it's not how many pounds you have. It's the percentages of concentration in the soil because those percentages are what affects the other elements. And if you have too little or too much, something else is going to be affected by it. And, you know, I've found that over the years. It was true when I came back home and did the soil test. We needed anywhere from 1 to 4 tons of calcium carbonate limestone on those high pH soils to get the percentage of calcium right. It's not how many pounds you need. It's getting the saturations properly so that everything else can work right. Well, this is where it all started. And we concentrated on the calcium first because it was soybean. And actually putting on the limestone that was needed. And the very next crop, soybean yields would go up on average of 15 bushel to the acre, from 30 bushel to 45. And I couldn't understand, why isn't everybody in this area doing that? Well, because there's no money in selling limestone. No.
Yeah, and they didn't know, right? I mean, the soil reports they were pulling,
your pH is high pH.
They didn't tell the whole story.
You don't need any calcium. You don't need any lime. And they were just looking at lime only is valuable at helping the pH. Well, there's a lot of comments that could be made there, but that's how it started out with Dr. Albrecht, and that's what changed my whole idea of what would be the best thing to be able to do for farming.
Absolutely. And that's what I was going to say, the why, right? Like, why did you dedicate your life to balancing soil or soil balancing rather than just that NPK model? And it sounds like that's kind of where you kind of dedicated your life at that point. You realized from Dr. William Albrecht what was going on.
Well, you know what
and
I really dedicated at that time?
This is where I need to go now.
I dedicated myself to studying why the soil worked. I didn't really at that time say, well, I'm going to go out and be a soil consultant. That was like 1967. I didn't start consulting until 73. But I didn't feel like I knew enough to tell somebody anything to do. Well, I mean, just grew up on a farm. We didn't even know what an agronomist was. You just found out what did the fertilizer company have for starter fertilizer that year and put on some starter and a little bit of nitrogen for whatever you're trying to grow, and that was your whole program. So what I started was I found out that I could study under Dr. Albrecht by private study course. And people that wanted to learn, he'd take you right under his wing and start. He was anxious to teach people what to do. And
he wanted to push on his legacy, what he's learned, really pass it forward to the next generation. And, that's similar to kind of what happened with us in the biological side. I had a gentleman that kind of brought me, I don't have any degrees in it, anything like that. I have a gentleman that brought me under his wing that had a passion for it and that said, we are living in the future. He holds 7 world-changing patents based off biological technology. And he brought me under his wing, and basically I became an intern. And I learned, from the inside. And that's kind of sounds like the same principle. He was willing to take you under and really teach you the truth.
Not only was willing to do it, but was willing to go to great lengths to do it. In that I was only at University of Missouri from 66 to 68, but I didn't finish his study course until 73. And what would happen is he would send you a sheet of 20 essay questions. And he'd say, all right, this is what this session's about. Here's all the things you need to read to find the answers. And then he said, after you've finished reading and feel like you know the answers, I want you to answer these 20 questions. And I don't care if it's with 2 words or 2 pages. I just want to know you know the right answers. And one of the other fellows that was already studying under him said, now always double space everything. Double space your answers. Because there's going to be one question after another that he just wants to be sure you understand. He's going to put some comments in there. And not only did he put some comments in there, I can't speak for everybody else, but sometimes there'd be an arrow and you turn it over and the whole back page was full of green ink, because that's how he graded he always graded paper with green ink. Not red ink.
Not red, but green.
His goal was just to teach people so he was sure they understood the principle that needed. And that's what he told me. He said, Neal, I'll teach you the basic foundation. Doesn't make you an agronomist. Even when I finished, he sent a certificate that said agronomist. He said, now you really aren't an agronomist. This is what he said in the letter. You really aren't an agronomist. You just have the principle. Now you go out and use this in the field and help farmers. And that's what will determine how much of an agronomist you are. And I've always remembered that and always tried to look at what can we do to be the most helpful.
Yeah, and now so many years down the line, 4 decades have passed, times past, Kinsey Agricultural Services, one of the leaders in doing just this, balancing soil, helping farmers, increase yields. I mean, all the different things that you do, balancing the soil, really, that's what it goes back to. If you could, can you explain the core concept of really feeding the soil versus the plant? Like, we really put everything in the soil. Can you explain that concept?
Actually, that is what I was taught by Dr. William Albrecht. He always said, feed the soil and let the soil feed the plants. And he would be critical. I still remember one of the first times he made that comment. He said, today, that was 1960s, they say the soil is just there to hold up the plant. We'll supply all the nutrients you need. We can just feed the plant, and that's all you need. Just feed the plant and get your yield. But he said, that's not what really determines the best production, whether it be yield or whether it be quality. He said you have to feed the soil, because the soil is what really feeds the plant and provides all those things we don't know how to measure, in addition to the ones we do measure. And what his comment always was is, look, it's the biology of the soil that matters. What we have to do is find out what we can do to most accommodate that biology. And he said, look at the keys to life. What are the things that everything needs for living? Well, shelter, food, water, and air. Okay, shelter, maybe you can get by a long time without. It depends on where you live. Food, a lot less time. Water, even less. But air, that's one that turns out to be so critical. And that's the key in terms of soil structure, to be able to get enough porosity in that soil so that we get a balance between the water and the air. In clay soils, generally we have too much water and not enough air. If there's something wrong, too much water, not enough air. In sandy soil, too much air, not enough water. And so you have to treat those soils completely different. And these are the things that he taught. And it has to do with what we need. If we need more space in the soil to get more air in there, well, then what do we do to increase the porosity of a soil? There's only one element that really dominates, and that's calcium. And what happens with calcium? Calcium actually causes the clay particles in the soil to gather up or clump up or flocculate. We say calcium flocculates the soil. Well, it causes clumps there. As it pulls them together, it increases the pore space. So you get bigger pore space. That allows for more air in comparison to water. And what do we want in a soil?
Yes.
Ideally, 25% air, 25% water, 50% minerals and humus. Well, so the space is 50% of it, and air ought to take up half, and water ought to take up half. Well, in sandy soils, what's the problem? Way too much air dries out too quick. We need more water. Turns out magnesium, potassium, and sodium has the same job in terms of looking at what it does to a soil, because every one of those causes the clay particles to disperse, to spread out. They reduce the pore space. In sand, we need less pore space. And it just turns out that the Israelis did a study in the 1990s in looking at sands, and they said not only does magnesium disperse the clay particles and reduce the amount of air in relation to water, but also magnesium has an affinity for water, and it actually causes, as you raise the magnesium in the soil to a more proper amount, it actually causes that soil to hold more water. So you're not just decreasing airspace for it to dry out, you're also increasing the ability of the mineral structure in that soil to hold more water. So it benefits both sides.
Absolutely. Now here where we're at, we got a lot of clay soils, heavy alkaline clay soils. You know what I mean? So we're on that first boat, always trying to get porosity and, flocculation of the particles in the soil to really give air. I mean, because it's septic soil out here. It's heavy clay, alkaline clay, a lot of salt, tough to grow stuff.
Alkaline side of it, not so much, but we have the heavy clay soils here in terms of extremely high magnesium levels. And on a lot of farms where dairy farms or something where they overdo manure close to the barn or things like that, the potassium levels actually even get up to the point that they actually reduce the pore space so that the water stands on top rather than going in, even though you got good calcium levels. The potassium still that's right.
Just too much potassium. Again, unbalanced soil, and it rejects certain things like the water, right? I mean, that's the whole point of it. If you don't mind, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If we have too much sodium, we don't have enough of something else. And generally it's going to be calcium. If we have too much potassium, we don't have enough of something else. Sometimes that's calcium or magnesium. If we have too much magnesium, it may be we're missing potassium, but generally always going to be missing calcium until some corrections are made. And you can correct soils and have all the calcium you need and still have too much magnesium. So it's not a matter of what we do necessarily. It's how we deal with what we have.
Sure, absolutely. And that all goes back to those base saturations, which that's what you're talking about. It's the base saturations of the soil. What's there? What needs balanced? How to balance them? If you don't mind giving us the big picture, why does soil chemistry dictate soil physics or the structure and biology?
That's right. I feel like what we covered right there tells us that really is the big picture, because what is it that influences the pore space? It's the mineral content. Well, what is the mineral content? That's soil chemistry.
That's right.
So we start looking at the chemistry in order to affect the physical structure, which means that's what determines the amount of pore space for the air and the water. And if we can get the pore space corrected, the air and water will basically balance out themselves, because you don't really balance it out and it's there permanently. You get too much rain, now we got too much water in that soil, but it'll bounce back a lot faster. If we get a drought, well, we don't have enough water there, but it'll bounce back a lot faster once we get that moisture there. It's amazing how much soil can tolerate if we get the nutrient levels right. People think, we just don't get enough rain. I have a client that gets 8 inches on average, 8 inches rainfall a year. And they have woody crops, apples, cherries, so on and so forth. And when I went to see them, everything was drip irrigation. Well, I said, your soil's barren. You need to have cover crops on. Oh, we can't raise cover crops. We only get 8 inches of rain a year. That was 20 years ago. They raise 2 cover crops a year now. They still only get 8 inches of rain. Correcting the soils makes so much difference. One fellow came to a course and he said, well, I don't really believe in soil tests, but I came with my neighbor here, and I just wanted to hear what you had to say. After it was over, he did some soil tests, and he was a cattleman in northwest Arkansas. And after it was over, he said, Neal, we have to feed hay every July and August because we just don't get enough rain. And it dries out, so you got to feed hay. Yeah. Well, he sent some samples, did what was called for, and 1 year later, when he sent his samples, he said, I put on what you said last fall. Now, he wasn't bending an arm and a leg because he didn't have real big, serious deficiencies and so forth. But he said, I put on what you said. And basically, what he needed was a lot of potassium and a lot of zinc. Some other things too, but those 2 things make the most difference in terms of water utilization. And he said, this is the first year I've ever not had to feed hay in July and August. He said, my grass stayed green and everybody else's died. It wasn't a matter of the rainfall. It was a matter of having the nutrients there to get that water into the plants.
Yeah, to be able to balance that soil, the microbial life, everything working in unison. That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm going to head on decoding the soil tests, and I always like this. We're looking for today to be on NPK side of things. Why do most standard soil tests fail to give growers the full picture? And then also on that kind of the second part, who do you personally suggest to use for soil testing, or who do you suggest?
First of all, why do most standard soil tests give growers, why don't they give the growers the full picture? Well, to me, the things that are most missing is we stop at pH and we get into a trap. That pH does not really tell you what you need. I actually have, one time in Western Australia, I put on a course, just dairymen. All dairymen there. One of them had sent samples, and he came up and handed me a sample, and he said, Neal, what can I put on this paddock to grow something here? He just said, what can I grow on this paddock? And I looked, and the pH was 6.5.
Sure.
And I looked at his soil test and handed it back to him and said, I wouldn't think anything would grow here.
Yeah.
And he said, it doesn't, not even weeds. He said, nothing grows there. Had a pH of 6.5. If pH is what matters, why didn't something grow there? His pH was...
Let's look at the nutritional side of things, right?
Because of the high sodium he had. He was right on the edge of right up close to the Indian Ocean. and that's what he had. He had severe potassium deficiency, severe magnesium deficiency, severe calcium deficiency. pH of 6.5 doesn't mean you're going to grow something. And that's an extreme, but you can get down to the very common things that we see all the time. And to me, the 2 things that cost the most money in agriculture is misunderstanding calcium and sulfur. That's the 2 things I think we are not focusing well enough on. And even the people who teach it in school don't really go out and see what happens in the fields. Until you start seeing what's happening in the field, I mean, almost any professor you talk to, if you tell them, well, I've got this client who had 2,000 acres of lettuce. We did the soil test. His pHs were 8.2 and 8.3, and he needed 4 tons of calcium carbonate limestone to correct his soil. They'd say, you're crazy. But that happens.
Yeah.
That happened.
You look at the deficiencies, right? That's what you zone in on. You get away from the abundances. You look at the deficiencies when you start doing your work to balance that soil. And so they don't give the full picture because they only show, like you said, they stop at pH, maybe some nitrogen, phosphorus. And that's the majority of those types of tests they're land grant type of university tests. That's what I see, at least. Like, that's really the basis of a lot of what they give. It's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, not necessarily full pictures. So who do you suggest, or who do you like to use for your soil testing, or who, is there numerous labs, or what do you like? I
only understand how to interpret a soil to get the best response from it, as long as that test is run the very same way that Dr. Albrecht said, this is the test needs to be used. Most people today say, oh, that's old fashioned. It costs too much. It takes too much time. You can't use that kind of a test. We need to just find out how to feed the plant and forget about feeding the soil. That just costs too much. You're going to go broke doing that. Every client I have that's been with us for years and years will have a story to tell you about how many people came and told them, you can't afford to do that. I can't afford to do that. Even after they did it and they tell people, we're doing it. Oh, we can't do that. We'll go broke. And so, first of all, I'd like to say that when people say the Albrecht Kinsey test, it's not the Kinsey test. It's Dr. Albrecht's teachings. It's just as valid today as it was the day I learned them 50 years ago. Just as valid.
And you've been carrying the banner for him, this whole time. That's the whole thing.
To absorb the things that he said. And I get amazed even today. You go out into a field and something will happen, and Dr. Albrecht said that 50 years ago, but you hadn't seen it before. But he knew what was going to happen. And the thing that he did was he said, look, once you establish the foundation, then it's just a matter of what kind of changes do we have to make in order to utilize that foundation correctly. And to me, that's the question. And so when you ask me what lab do I use, all of our samples from all over the world, from any country, if we're going to make the best recommendation, we have to have a soil test we understand. And that test is run for me by Bob Perry at Perry Ag Labs in Bowling Green, Missouri. But if you send a soil test there and say we want a soil test, you're going to get the soil test that the universities use. Because when I started with them, I said, well, I want to use the proper test. But once we get results, there are going to be other people calling you and say, well, we want that same test done, but they don't know, they haven't been taught how to use it. And remember, I spent from 1967 to 1973 learning how to use it before I ever did anything with it. It isn't a matter that you just sit down, now I understand it. I'm still learning today how to do things that we didn't, we'd never met before. But I will say this, as long as you apply good common sense, it may take a while, but if you look hard enough, you can find the answers. And I think that's the biggest problem with our ag science. We're not looking to find answers. We're looking to verify all the stuff that somebody wants to pay to be verified. And
yep. And that's what's happening is there's companies that are coming in paying for tests to be done, for certain research to be done, and the actual true core of what needs to be taught isn't being taught. It's really kind of guided by big money, big companies wanting tests for their products certain ways versus really, showing the truth of what's going on. That's
put on a training program for a large fertilizer company in California. And one of the field men wanted to invite the lab chemist from one of the big companies that they were using for soil tests out there to come to the meeting. And the president of the company said, okay, he can come, but he can't ask any questions except in the breaks and so forth, because Neal will never get through his 3 days if we have too many questions. Well, so at the breaks and lunch and so forth, we'd spend time, and after the meeting was over, sit down talking for various comments or questions he wanted to make. And after the 3 days, he said, Neal, I really appreciate what you're teaching and so forth. But he said, we can't take a soil test and do what you're doing. He said, the soil tests that are being used today, everybody wants an answer quickly. So he said, we'll have soils and they will have clients send in soil, but they want an answer real fast. And he said, by changing our methods, we can do 3 times more samples and for much less cost than what it costs for you to do those samples. But he said, in the end, then we can't tell the farmer, okay, you put on this many pounds of manganese and that's going to raise your level by this much. He said, if we see a manganese deficiency, we just say, well, your number's too low. You need manganese, but we can't tell you how much. Put on this much. Now, if you get there, that's fine. But if you need more, we'll put on some more manganese next year. But he said, we can't tell how many pounds you need or how many pounds is going to increase by the amount, by the tests we're doing. It's just a matter of, well, you're deficient or you're not deficient. So, to me, that's the problem with soil tests today, and there's more to it than that. When you ask about the soil lab we use and so forth, I only understand how to read results from the samples that I actually studied what those numbers mean in the field. And I feel like the advantage was Dr. Albrecht had already been doing that for decades, be able to say, this is what the numbers need to be as long as you run the test the same way. Now, that's the question is, are the tests run in the same way? And the answer is generally no, and it's a good reason why they aren't. And that is every lab has to have a model soil in order to recalibrate their equipment and so forth. You got to have something to test it by to know what would, and sometimes a lab will recalibrate 2 or 3 times a day, depending on how many samples they're running, just to be sure they're getting the right answers. I don't know if most people will remember this, but when I was growing up, you didn't listen to FM radio very often. You just listened to AM because FM would drift off the station. Well, that's the same way with the equipment. It's sort of, after being used a while, maybe it gets miscalibrated or whatever. So you go back and make sure it's going to give you the same answer all the time. Well, you got to have a model soil to do that by, and there is no model soil. Every lab has to choose a soil to do those tests by. So if I say something, I'm not trying to be critical of anybody else's lab. It's just that Dr. Albrecht said it's not the numbers you get, it's what those numbers mean in the field. And what I tell people is test your soil tester. Test us, test anybody.
Sure.
If you go out and take samples from the worst place you've got on the farm and the best place you have on the farm and send those in and say which one's good and which one's bad, if somebody can't pick that out from a soil test, what good is that soil test? So, and there are people who have worked with other lab soil tests for years and years and years. They know just as well what those numbers mean as I do from ours. And I'll just give one example. Actually, he was a plant pathologist, but he was head of all the soil fertility for Bimbo bakeries out of Mexico. And he wanted me to come down and teach their agronomy people about what we knew about nutrients and so forth. I said, well, there's just one problem. Your tests and my tests don't match up in terms of numbers. And he said, well, Neal, you just go by what your numbers are. We'll pull tests and we'll use the same soils and we'll mix them up.
Yep.
We'll send half of it to you and we'll use the other half. And you just say what you see on yours. And then I'll say what we need to do on ours. And what I found out was when we said we needed 10 pounds of zinc sulfate or something of that nature, our numbers may be completely different from his, but he arrived at the same answer. And I mean, he understood what his soil test meant. I didn't. I understood what mine meant, didn't understand his. And I think we have a consultant in Germany that works with us, has for quite some time. He also farms, but he's worked with a lot of farmers there. And he said, Neal, when farmers bring a soil test from another company to me, I don't say it's like reading another language, which is what I told people. The French and the English use the same alphabet. But if you give me a book that's written in French and it has all the answers that I need to know what I don't know yet in terms of agriculture, I can't read French. Same thing with numbers. You can take the number that's just 1 to 0 to 9, but you put them in different sequences and it's like reading a different language. You got to find out what that number means. Well, he said, I tell a farmer this, and he said, they seem to understand it very quickly. You can't use a John Deere manual to fix an international tractor. And he said, that's what.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's what we're trying. That's what people are asking you to do. You're getting something with a whole different set of parameters. And they say, well, tell me what's wrong with my soil.
There you have it.
Dr. Albrecht told us time and again, do not try to read another lab soil test without learning what it means, or you will be wrong. He said, you can't apply our numbers to another soil test and get the same answers. He said, you'll be wrong. And you know what? the few times in 50 years I've been convinced, well, it's a good reason to try, that's maybe a dozen times, I've always been wrong. When we finally see the tests come back and say what we needed to do, did the best job I could do, but the numbers are different.
Absolutely. And one more time, if you would, just for the audience, the place that you utilize for your soil testing?
Well, all of our samples from all over the world is sent to Perry Ag Labs in Bowling Green, Missouri. But if you send a sample to Perry Ag Labs in Bowling Green, Missouri, you don't get the Albrecht test.
Sure.
If you ask for the Albrecht test, you'll say, well, that you get that by having if you say we want the same analysis as Neal Kinsey uses, well, they'll say, well, okay, we can do that, but you need to contact Neal. Now, why is that? Because when I first talked to Bob and I said, well, what's going to stop everybody from doing this? And they don't know how to do it. You know, you got to study and learn how to get those answers, because everything we do is a formula. It is not just looking at a number. You sit down and work out the formula. And he said, Neal, the only people that will get this test from us are those that you approve. Because he said nobody basically knows to ask for that test anyway. And so we'll just be sure it doesn't get skewed by doing it that way.
Interesting. That's great. If you could, next, we'll move on. Base saturations explained. Can you break down the importance of calcium, magnesium, and potassium ratios within a soil?
Well, first of all, what I would say is Dr. Albrecht always stressed percentages, and I never heard him. I'm not saying he never did, but he never used, well, we had this ratio or that ratio. Now, the reason being, if we start looking at a sandy soil, because we need less calcium and more magnesium, in general, a sandy soil will get closer to 60% calcium and 20% magnesium. Well, that's 3-to-1. But on a heavy clay soil, it'll get closer to 70% calcium and 10% magnesium. That's 7-to-1. So a ratio, when we start trying to look at a ratio of calcium to magnesium, those ratios don't really work. So,
which is what you explained earlier about having the incorrect minerals put into certain soils. You have to treat sandy soils different than clay-based soils.
That's right.
And those ratios hold true across those types of soils.
And in those cases, there is a formula that you sit down, and in sand, it's very much more complicated than it is in clay. It's much harder to figure because every time the sand drops from, say, 5.16 to 5.14, it's a different formula that you have to use there, or else, now you might think, oh, you can't possibly make that much of a mistake there. If you're going to figure out what you really need, we have to be exacting. So that won't make as much difference as something, something major like going from an exchange capacity of 8.7 down to 4.0. But all those sandy soils, you have to figure them based on a specific formula. And each time the exchange changes, the formula changes. Not much, but enough to make a difference.
Now, and then once you get those gaps filled, that's when your crops take off, the soils are healthy, and things really, they really grow. They really provide yield and health and all of those different things.
We had a farmer that farmed about 3,000 acres of sand, and he didn't think he could make more than 150 bushel corn. Sure. Well, he started doing some things, and he got up to maybe 175 because somebody was advising him and so forth. When we came in and started working with him on his sands, his yields actually went up to 250 to 265 bushel on really light sands, black sands, red sands, yellow sand, white sand. If you put the nutrients there properly, you can raise really good crops on those soils. A lot of people, sandy soil, you can't raise. If you try to treat them just like everything else, you can't raise the best crop. But if you treat those sands the way they need to be treated, I've had clients that'll say, when we start using your program, our old sandy fields that we thought weren't very good actually started to out yield the clay fields because they concentrated on the sand and it didn't take very much. And they said, now our sand's out yielding our clays. What we used to think was our best field and our worst fields have completely changed. So, you don't know what the potential is until you get to the top. And that's the biggest problem I see in agriculture today. people they get discouraged by whoever or whatever and say, oh, somebody might be able to do this, but I can't. Yeah. I put on 2 programs for a fertilizer company in South Africa last February, a year ago, SSK Fertilizer Company. And they had clients come in and 2 different weeks, 2 different courses. And after the second course, one at the end, they had one farmer to stand up, and he was more or less speaking to say thanks for coming for everybody there. And he said, Neal, first time you came to South Africa in 2002, I heard you speak in Durban, and I went home and started using your program. And he said, I doubled my yields on the whole farm. It wasn't doubling yields on a little place here or there, but he said, I had so much differences that when you did it, I doubled the yield. He said, my neighbors started, how did you do that? And he said, I would tell them, oh, you can't do that. We can't afford it. And he said, one of the neighbors, finally, it got so bad for his situation that he decided he needed to sell one of his farms. So he came to me and said, well, I'm going to have to sell a farm. Would you be interested in buying it? He said, I bought that farm. I used your program. I doubled the yields. That man, in all those years, he said he couldn't afford to do it, but he said, all you do is you come in and start looking at what you need, and it worked. And he said, I've been doing that since 2002, and I keep buying land that people say you can't fix.
That's what I was going to say. At the end of the day, you can't afford not to do it.
That's right.
If you can double your yield just by balancing, base saturations, balancing the soil, tell me you can't afford to not do it at that point, right? It's just people are scared. They're stuck in their ways of doing things a certain way and knowing about what their yield is. They can never even fathom doubling their yield or buying more farms, right? If anything, they're figuring out how to keep their farm.
Yeah. And the other part of that was, he said, Neal, that was just with calcium, magnesium, potassium percentages. He said, I didn't really hear what you said about trace elements back then. Now you talked about trace elements. I'm going to go home and see what more I can do.
Man, I tell you. Well, I'm going to keep moving through this. Why is too much of a nutrient sometimes worse than too little? So we're looking at both sides, right? If you have too much of a nutrient, what can it cause?
Well, too much of a nutrient, if it can be different, can cause different things. But let's just look at, if we have a soil and we're working to build the potassium levels in it, and some sandy soils or some places that they use a lot of compost or manure, this can happen. That is, once the potassium gets above 7.5% saturation, there are 2 things in terms of excess. That's excessive potassium. Anything above 7.5, you're going to start causing problems. The first problem is going to tie up boron. And what does boron do? Well, if you're tying up boron, what that means is boron's the grain builder. It makes the seed or the grain or the fruit. So now all of a sudden your yield is going to be affected. And what does it affect? The size. If you don't have enough boron, you get smaller beans. You get smaller kernels or less kernels on the cob. You get smaller fruit, smaller apples, whatever it may be. But then the other side, if you're organic, you'll see this more so than you will if you're conventional. But even on conventional, you watch and see. The higher potassium goes above 7.5%, the more weed problems you're going to have. So I don't know what that is, but it's not on this side.
Yeah, for some reason our some music went off.
Yeah.
All right, we got it. You keep going now. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah, no, that was an interruption on our side, buddy.
Well, in terms of potassium, anytime you're above 7.5% potassium, you're going to have more weed pressure. If you're conventional, It's going to be harder to get the same herbicides to work. If you're organic, you know it really quick. I mean, I've had organic growers, and I'd say, well, excess potassium increases weed pressure. And let me just see if, when I tell you where your worst weeds are, if that doesn't correlate. And it correlates time after time. One client that we had in Quebec, Canada, that grew organic carrots, and he grew organics. But anyhow, I said, we were looking at the soils, and I said, well, let me see if I can tell you where you had the most problem with weed, because he said, it costs us more money to control weeds than it does for the fertility. Our fertilizer program is not our highest expense. It's controlling weeds. And when I named the field, he said, that's always where we have the most problem.
Yep. And it was
Just
based
coming
off
in there and
potassium.
controlling that excess makes a difference.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, that's a big deal. That is, and that's when that's a perfect example of what you said. When you have too much of a nutrient, now you're growing weeds. Now you're growing crops of weeds on top of your crop, right? And I mean, that's a perfect way to explain it. How about the calcium to magnesium connection? Will you discuss a little bit how these two elements control soil aeration and water retention, and why tight clay soils are often a magnesium issue, not just a clay issue? But I'll let you explain it, Neal. I mean, you're going to be the one to let our audience know.
We talked somewhat about that earlier, and that has to do with the effect of calcium and magnesium, and put potassium and sodium in there right along with magnesium, because every one of those will actually disperse the clay particles, which reduces the porosity, which makes a soil tighter.
That's right.
When you increase the porosity, that makes the soil be able to be more friable and work well. So, first of all, when we start looking at calcium, if we have an excess of calcium ties up everything. When you start putting on extra calcium, it's going to affect when something, as Dr. Albrecht would always point out, the soil is always full. You don't have a part of the soil that's empty. If it doesn't have enough of something, it's going to have too much of something else. And one of the things is if you have a soil that doesn't have anything else, what's going to be there? A whole bunch of extra hydrogen, which is real low pH, high acidity, and so forth. But when you take calcium and start putting calcium on a soil, even if you need a lot of calcium, when you start putting it on, you need to look at where your trace elements are. Because if you barely have enough of manganese or copper or zinc, three of the elements that we look at all the time, if you barely have enough and you put limestone on, it within the time it takes for that lime to break down, which is generally a period of 3 years, if that's just looking at common agricultural lime, takes 3 years for it to break down. Sometime during that 3 years, you're going to cause whatever is borderline to become deficient. So you can actually create deficiency. That's not saying don't lime the soil. Yeah. That's just saying that we need to know what's going to happen when we do, so that we can correct those deficiencies before they start to hurt us.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it all is based off of, like you said, you put down lime, it could cause another deficiency. So you have to that's where the base saturation balancing comes in.
It could, but here's the thing. When you put down lime, it always reduces the availability of other things in that soil. So if you got too much, that's good. If you have more than you need, that's still okay. But if you have borderline or deficiencies already, it's just going to make them worse.
Gotcha. Then you have to address those, like you said. Then you have to make sure that those are addressed, or you run down a whole nother problem, whole nother set of problems. It's another road.
And the other part of that is that you may put the limestone on now, but how many farmers 3 years from now remember they even put limestone on, or how much? I'm not being critical or anything, but you'll ask a farmer, when's the last time? Well, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, 2 years. The time gets by real fast. And they forget that it's going to take 3 years to see the full effects of what you do this year in terms of lime, whether it's calcitic lime or dolomitic lime or whatever. And the other part of that is, to me, is the problem with the magnesium. When your percentage of magnesium is less than 10% on any soil, Dr. Albrecht would always say that you're always going to have a magnesium deficiency in whatever you grow there. You don't get enough magnesium into a plant unless that saturation of that soil is at least 10%.
Gotcha.
But on clay soils, when that magnesium gets above 12, it starts to restrict the porosity to the point we don't get enough air in that soil. And when we don't get enough air in that soil, it affects the biology and how that biology works. So we don't have the right environment for the biology to do its best. Legumes show this the easiest. If you're growing a legume of any type, until you get on soil that have an exchange capacity of 8.7 or higher, until you get your magnesium between 10 and 12, you'll always have a magnesium deficiency in what you're trying to grow there. If you're below 10, you're going to be deficient. If you're above 12, the higher you go, the more deficient it becomes. the more aeration is restricted and the more nitrogen it takes to grow the same crop.
Sure.
We have to have the air for the nitrosomonas and the other bacteria to do the work they do to break down and make the nitrogen available. So if we put on too much magnesium or too much potassium or too much sodium, from whatever reason, then that's going to cause us a problem of having the aeration so that the microbes or the soil biology can do what they need to do.
Absolutely. And that's what I was going to say, you know, going back to that soil like the biological side of the soil, putting lime on, things like that. Are you seeing release curves that are quicker ever than 3 years, or is it pretty much always standard 3 years? Like if you have a soil that is very microbial active, good broad spectrum microbes built into the soil, it's healthy, it's living, it's thriving. Can you see release curves less than that 3 years, or is it pretty much still always about that 3 year time frame?
You see your maximum effects after 3 years, whether that's positive or negative. But just coming back to home, whenever I came back and started applying, our very next door neighbor was one of the first clients that I worked with. And they needed basically a ton of calcium carbonate and a ton of gypsum to the acre. And that would straighten out their calcium to magnesium relationship on about 5 farms. Well, he put the gypsum on and he put the ton of limestone on the first year. The very next year, the yield on his soybeans went from 30 bushel, this is on 5 farms, from 30 bushel to 45. He actually had a couple of fields that made 55. That was the field that had the best potassium level. But he didn't put any potassium on the first year. He said, Neal, I've never spent a dime for lime or fertilizer in my whole life. I've grown soybeans for 20 years. What did I do first? Well, for soybeans, for legumes, the calcium was the most important part, so we had him put the calcium on. But he had 2 fields that had adequate potassium. And where those potassium levels were adequate, that made him an extra 10 bushel beans right there. And it just so happened that year, research came out from the experiment farm from University of Missouri in southeast Missouri, and they said, if you put on enough potassium, it'll make you another 7 to 10 bushels of soybean. Well, he just saw it right there on his own field. So next year,
based off putting on calcium, right? Fixing the calcium.
So the next year he puts on potassium. Well, long story short, it took 3 years and he was back past 50. He was at 55 bushel soybean on 5 different farms. It wasn't a matter of one little field or one little place. It was a matter of, now, did he straighten his soil completely out in 3 years? There are some soil. I had one client here that he'd put on so much dolomitic limestone to correct his pH that he had twice as much magnesium after we corrected the calcium. He still had twice as much magnesium as he needed. And then your only choice is, once you've used the calcium to control as much as you can, now what do you use to drive it out? Well, the only thing that drives magnesium out of a soil that I know about is sulfur. So we sit down and figure out how many pounds of magnesium do you still have to get rid of, and it takes 2 pounds of sulfur to get out 1 pound of magnesium. Figured out how much that was. Why, even if we increased his yield by, 50 bushel to the acre, it took so much sulfur. I said, there's no way you come out economical to put this sulfur on and then say, well, we're going to make a profit this year. It's got too costly. So in his case, I said, we'll just emphasize, we've corrected the calcium, we'll just emphasize the sulfur and sulfates as much as we can based on your fertilizer program. Long story short, we started in 1980. The last fields were finally corrected in 1995.
Wow,
Took 15 years. But in the meantime, he was making a profit all the time. He wasn't he wasn't taking more money and spending it that he didn't need to. But when he finally got those soils corrected, that's when they did their best. And he knew he had some that got corrected earlier, and he said, it's worth doing this. I'm going to keep on doing it until I got it done. He's in his 90s today. He's still in charge of his 4,000 acres, and he still will say, you got to control the calcium, magnesium. Get them there right, or you're not going to have the right yields.
Yeah. And the thing is like the wisdom that he brings is you don't want to take, 15 years to correct it, right? Like just start out from the get-go. If you can balance these things, really, really pay attention to it from the very beginning. Don't just guess.
This is the thing about the Albrecht program. And that is, we actually teach the consultants that work with us. We've got about 80 guys around the world that have come in and studied and learned the formulas and how to work with it and what it does and so forth. And the thing that we teach all of them is, once you understand what the needs are for a soil, then all you need to know is the crop that you're wanting to grow and the average, the average yield. In other words, not what you want to make, but what's the proven yield average. Take that proven yield average and then take a look at what the soils need, and based on what crop you're growing, you can prioritize those nutrients and say, oh, this is number one, this is number two, this is number three. And as long as you're looking at material that build the levels in the soil, you can start spending the money, and eventually something that's missing gets to the point where it's not really the limiting factor anymore. Now you can keep going down the list. So you just spend whatever your fertilizer budget is, but you put it where it makes the most difference. The problem is getting farmers who will believe that they need to put their money here instead of what they've always done in the past, because they've just gotten used to the idea, well, I can't afford not to do that. But if you start looking at and use fertilizers that are soil feeders rather than plant feeders. What's a plant feeder? That's something you put on, and if you don't get it this year, then you got to put it on again next year.
That's right.
Now, there are three materials that we've got to look at that are plant feeders, and that's nitrogen, sulfur, and boron. Because if you don't use them there and you don't have a compaction layer there, they're going to leach out, and generally they're going to leave in 12 months unless you have really high humus to help hold some of it. So many soils don't.
Yeah,
so
they're destroyed over time.
Yep. So when we start looking at soils, it isn't a matter to say, okay, we're going to put back everything we've taken out for how long it's been farmed. When somebody says you can't afford to do that, they're generally right. How do you justify replacing everything you've taken out over years and years and years in 1 year? What you do is you look and say, okay, of all the things that are here that I need to grow the crop, what really is most limiting? And most people don't know what's most limiting. They just look at how many pounds does it take to grow this many bushel, and basically concentrate on NPK and liming and maybe sulfur. Most of the time not.
Yeah, depending on where they're at in the U.S., right? Yep. Like that's what they're looking at.
Yep. So, but if you have a soil test that really tells you what is there, and then you have you have an idea of what crop you're going to grow, so that you can say, well, what makes the most difference in that crop? Then you can prioritize those nutrients and just say, spend the same amount of money you always spend, but at least you're putting it where it's going to make the most difference. And even if they just take one field and split it, it won't take long before they start to say, well, whenever we put the money where we need to, it's going to make us a better yield, or either yield or quality.
You allocate that money. Yeah. You allocate that money for return on investment versus just yield, right? Like that's that's what it comes down to. And a lot of these producers and farmers, Neal, they're smart people. They understand return on investment. They understand finances, you know, and when you start putting it that way and you break it down and you can say, well, this is your most limited. You need this, and watch what happens to your yield. Making small changes like that, it puts the money back to where it's like, well, this makes a lot of sense on why I'm doing this. Helps them maybe jump off that cliff a little further to do all 5 farms like that other gentleman or whatever it may be. No, that's great. I'm going to get into the next part, the role of trace minerals, which I think this is good. Explain how a tiny deficiency in, say, like boron or copper can bottleneck an entire harvest, if you would.
Well, first of all, I'll just say a year ago in September, I put on a meeting, about the 4th or 5th meeting I put on in Belize, down in Central America. And one of the guys that came to it says, Neal, all we grow is rice and soybeans. But he said, we started putting on what you recommended, but the last thing we put on was copper. And he said, where we put the copper on, it increased our soybean yield by another 5 bushels per acre. And he said, there wasn't anything that we even thought would be able to do that. But he said, he said, I'll have neighbors now that'll get soil tested and say, well, how important is it to put on copper? And he said, if you leave it off, it's going to hurt your yield. Now,
Sure.
There is research going on that most people are not aware of, even though it's being talked about in university meetings. It's not necessarily the agronomists that are talking about it. It's the people that are involved in fruit and vegetable growing, things of this nature. But Tim Reinbott works at University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. That's where Dr. Albrecht actually did all his work. He was right there from Columbia. Well, Tim's in charge of all the research farms in the state of Missouri. And any research that's done, they take care of the randomized replicated plots and putting on the nutrients and so forth. And he actually was speaking at an organic conference because his specialty before he did this was compost and cover crops. And he was speaking at an organic conference in St. Louis. And afterward, he came to me and said, Neal, I think it's time we took a look at the Albrecht program again, because he said, I know people that are using your program and their yields are better. And he said, they see the difference and they're telling me, he said, we need to do randomized replicated test plot. That was 10 years ago. They started out with corn and soybeans in rotation, still doing that. But then later on, at about third or fourth year, they also started with pasture, doing research on pasture grasses. And one of the things that he mentioned as time went on, he said, you know, the Albrecht system, when you put on everything, including the trace elements, everything that's called for, always makes the highest yield. But he said, if you just pick out one trace element and you think, oh, that won't make any difference, and you cut that out, the yield drops. He said, just leaving one out, the yield actually goes down. Now,
Sure.
The other side of that is what happens in terms of crops and so forth if you leave out one element, say copper. That copper costs a lot, and a lot of people don't want to build their copper levels up. But we'll talk about a small amount of copper and what difference that can make in just a minute. But
Yeah.
in terms of looking at the copper levels, and you look at what the costs are, copper is necessary in soils. In order to get enough into the plant, we have to have at least 2 parts per million copper. Now, 2 parts per million copper doesn't sound like very much, but until you get above that, we don't have the stalk strength and resilience. And copper gives stalk strength, but potassium and manganese are necessary for stalk strength. And I say both of those you have to have in addition to the copper to get stalk strength.
Sure.
But the copper gives you resilience. That's what lets the plant bend and not break. If you're growing corn and you have the stalk that breaks off, you know, the green snap in corn, take a look and see where your copper levels are, because copper gives stalk strength and resilience. You get enough copper into that plant, and then all of a sudden it will bend and not break. This translates all the way up from corn all the way to papaya trees in Florida and Hawaii. You'll see papaya trees if you go to where they're growing them, and the wind will blow and they'll snap off about a foot up off the ground. They don't have enough copper. Now, they may not have enough manganese or potassium, but you put the potassium and manganese there, and unless you get the copper, we still don't have enough ability to bend and not break.
Gotcha. So you're basically saying, you know, the boron, the copper, it'll bottleneck that whole harvest due to the fact then kind of that I'm taking, like your most limited nutrients only as well as that crop's going to do. Period.
And with boron, it's easy to tell.
Uh-huh.
When I say that, if you're growing wheat and you have less than 2 parts per million boron, all you have to do is put on enough boron to get above 2 parts per million in the soil, and you'll see it in the grain of the wheat. And that's because in terms of wheat, the kernels in the middle fill out first. So they're going to be big and puffy first. The ones at the top fill out next. The ones at the bottom fill out last. If you've got less than 2 parts per million copper, if you've got if you have less than 2 parts per million copper and you're growing wheat, it's going to lodge. It's going to fall over because you just don't have enough there to stand it. But if you have less than 0.8 parts per million boron, what happens in those cases is the grains at the bottom will be shriveled. And I've seen wheat in Germany that was making 200 bushels to the acre, and they had less than 2 parts per million boron. They had high humus content, but they had less than 2 parts per million boron. And the grains at the bottom of the head were shriveled.
Always shriveled.
You can't get away from it. If you're less than 0.8 parts per million boron, or you don't put enough on there to stay above that, you're going to get shriveled grain in the bottom of the head.
Interesting.
If it's shriveled in the bottom and then shriveled in the top too, then you're even worse off. And the other part of that is you can have put on enough boron, not get enough boron into the plant, because calcium is the key to getting uptake of boron into the plant. So if you don't have enough calcium, you can have good boron levels and still have boron deficiency.
And then you have that limited nutrient, and then you have shriveled grain or whatever that may look like, depending on the crop that you're growing and the needs of that boron.
And for those who are growing corn, a lot of people will say, oh, it's the weather, or oh, it's a phosphate deficiency, because they'll have big amounts of phosphate and keep adding phosphate because the kernels don't fill out to the end of the cob. If you've got a good straight cob and the rows of corn are nice and straight on that cob, that's not a phosphate problem. If they're nice and straight, but they don't fill out all the way to the end, a lot of people, oh, it got too cold, it got too hot. Generally, what you can say is if you're below 0.8 parts per million boron, same as for the wheat, the kernels won't fill out all the way to the end of the cob. But if
it's a limited nutrient, or it's a deficiency, huh?
Yeah, it's a boron deficiency, and there are even corn companies that will say, oh, it's genetics. It never filled out to the end. You correct the boron and have enough calcium there to get it in, and it'll fill out right to the end. One company said, oh, well, you just didn't plant a high enough population. You only planted 30,000 population. Well, one of the guys down the road had made a mistake and planted 40,000 population. It still filled out all the way to the end. So it wasn't the genetics.
There you have it. Goes back to boron, not necessarily the population, right?
Yeah, and the other part of that is so many people don't know where the numbers are, where they have to be in order to get the response. Dr. Albrecht defined that long before I was even there, but people don't put confidence in it.
No, it's I could say it's a lost art, right? I mean, that's the easiest way I can say it.
Either
the way that you balance and the way that you do that.
Never got going in the first place.
Well, yeah, that's a good point too. It's they don't want you to know necessarily the art, right? Because it's not too fancy just to sell boron and copper. You got to sell a whole package of other things in order to make the money, right? Or at least that's the way a lot of people look at it.
That's right. And this is the thing. They'll stick a little bit of everything in there saying, well, it's a shotgun approach. Well, if you happen to hit one of them, then that's going to make a difference. But why not barrel in and use it like a rifle and say, okay, this is the target I really need to deal with first, because that's the one that's most limiting for whatever it is you're trying to produce. And
absolutely.
It's not always yield. Sometimes it's also quality.
Absolutely. And then that kind of leads into the next part. Give us your experience with the hidden limiting factors of sulfur, zinc, and manganese, which you kind of did earlier a little bit. But there's some experience with those hidden limiting factors. If you do have limiting factors in any of those, sulfur, zinc, and manganese, it can cause major issues, correct?
All right. Well, in terms of sulfur, if you're short on sulfur, and the old rule of thumb is if you got a crop that requires nitrogen, well, for every 10 pounds of N, you need 1 pound of sulfur. I'm going to tell you that might have worked back when we had high sulfur coal and high sulfur in the fuel and things of this nature, but it doesn't work today. What we find is the nitrogen to sulfur relationship. See how much nitrogen it takes to produce your crop. Divide that by 5. And that's what kind of sulfur it takes. The pound of nitrogen divided by 5. Now, for the sulfur you already have in your soil and the nitrogen you already have in your soil, you don't have to put that part on, but find out what's still not there and make up the difference. And for high-yielding corn, we generally find out sulfur is a limiting factor, if not the limiting factor, in the ear leaf at tassel if we don't get enough sulfur on there. And if we're looking at high-yield corn, we'll add 80, 90, 100, 120, depending on how high up you go. Make sure that we have enough sulfur there to produce that corn crop. As long as you're making those high yields, that's fine. But if you stick on 120 pounds of sulfur and you're only making 175 bushel corn, you wasted your money on the sulfur. because in 175 bushel corn, basically 70 or 80 pounds is going to be enough.
And that's all based off that nitrogen number. That's where you derive it from.
Based off the nitrogen number and also the measurement of the sulfur in the soil. We'll take that.
Yep.
Whatever pounds you already got, we'll take that off of it.
Oh, that's perfect. What about the zinc and manganese?
Well, in terms of use of manganese, you have to be careful there because many times, let's just put it, anytime you have less than 60% saturation of calcium in a soil, it's not going to be efficient at getting the manganese in. So if you barely have enough manganese and we don't have a good calcium level, we're going to have a manganese deficiency, even though once we corrected the calcium, we could say, well, we're getting enough manganese into that plant. Now, next thing is, don't see this very often in corn, soybean, unless the guy has a lot of compost and manure. But if your potassium goes above 10, if your potassium sodium, total percentage of potassium sodium goes above 10%, the higher it goes above 10%, the more it blocks the manganese out of being taken into the plant. Now, when I say it blocks it out, that means it doesn't tie it up. You can look on the soil test and say, oh, we got great manganese. But the manganese can't get in because the potassium and sodium crowds it out. If you're above 10%, it doesn't get close to being there, close enough to the root to be taken up into the soil solution. So as a consequence, you can have manganese deficiencies when, in fact, it's not the manganese that's missing. Any soil that we see that has above 40 parts per million manganese, it's generally not the manganese causing the problem. It's something else affecting that manganese. Now, if you don't have 40 parts per million manganese, what good is manganese anyway? Well, manganese is probably the trace element that we have to have from start to finish. We have to have manganese to get the seed to germinate. You have to have manganese to get it to go off the fastest. It will not go off as quick if you are short on manganese. But it's necessary to germinate the seed, to get it to go off fastest, to continue to grow. And as a matter of fact, if you've got corn and your manganese is below 30 parts per million on the test that we use. Now, manganese, that's another thing we haven't talked about, and that is soil tests for trace elements go all over the place. We see a lot of soil labs that say you've got good levels or excellent levels or high levels, and I mean some that will say it's too high when ours still show it's deficient. And it's a matter then who you're going to believe and what do you do? You have to look and see what's going to make the difference. But in terms of manganese, so many tests jump all over the place. And most of the time, our level will show much higher than other tests, and that scares people to death. Oh, we got so much manganese there, we shouldn't put more on, when in actual fact, we still don't have enough. So
it's still a limiting factor.
Yeah, and in terms of corn, if you're below 40 parts per million, it doesn't show up so easy. If it's soybeans, by the time you get to 37 or 38, if you go out there just before time the beans are supposed to start ripening up, you can learn to distinguish, well, that's a manganese deficiency because it'll be sort of a golden color into the leaf that's not really, it's time for it to start losing its leaves, but you'll start seeing that off color to those leaves, even at 37 or 38 parts per million. But with corn, you don't see anything visually until it gets down to about 33 parts per million. And what you'll see then, it stunts the corn. It won't grow as tall. So all these, it doesn't take very much. Most of these things, we're talking about hundreds of a pound to grow the crop, not pounds, but hundreds of a pound to get into the plant. It just takes a lot of pounds outside to get enough there to get the saturation right.
Yeah. And if it's not there, you're in trouble, right?
Yeah.
If you're not there and you don't have it, you're in trouble. Those hundreds of a pound, or whatever it may be, that's trouble. Perfect. Let's discuss a little bit about micronutrients, pest, disease resistance. How does that balanced soil chemistry create a natural immune system for plants? Reducing the need for, say, rescue chemistry like pesticides and fungicides.
Well, first of all, if we even talk about looking at the nutrient levels in the soil, let's just come back to copper again. If you're growing wheat and you have less than 2 parts per million copper, and you put on, just take one field or half of each field for 2 or 3 fields, whatever way you want to do it to do an experiment. But put on 5 pounds of 23% copper sulfate, dry, mixed into your fertilizer. Broadcast that on half the field or a portion of the field, mark where it is. And if you have rust that year, basically that's enough copper to stop the rust right to the line. Now, it might not be above 2 parts per million, but once you get above 2 parts per million, what you'll find is copper really is great at stopping rust in wheat. Most wheat just doesn't have anywhere close. So get that above 2, that works fine. But it works for wheat. Doesn't work for soybeans. That's not enough. For soybeans, if you want to stop rust in soybeans, you got to get it up to about 5 parts per million, which is going to cost you quite a bit more money. But the clients we had that are above 5 will tell you, we don't have Brazilian soybean rust.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. You're either going to spend it on the input you're putting into your soil and balance your soil and do it properly, or you're going to end up buying sprays that are copper fungicides or whatever to get rid of your rust anyways.
Forever.
And then not only that, but leave an open petri dish, right? Because not only did it get rid of the rust, it got rid of all your beneficial microbes. It got rid of everything. So where do you want to spend your money? Really, that's what it comes down to. And
let's go just a little further there, and that is for very perishable products like raspberries and blackberries. 5's not enough. If you want to get rid of rust in blackberries and raspberries, things like that, it's got to be 12 to 15 parts per million copper. And I mean, it has to be that on certified organic in order to do that. We have a client in California that raises 170 acre plus of certified organic raspberries. And the first thing they'll do when they get new land is get the copper levels up to 12, between 12 and 15, because he said, until we get there, we're not going to be able to control the rust in there. But he said, once we get there, we can pick raspberries in a misty rain and still don't get rust, which people just have trouble believing. But,
and it's been uptaken into the plant. The plant's naturally resisting those things, the rust or whatever it may be. Same type of situation happens with the utilization of, pesticides as well, and pests and, sucking type of insects and insects that eat on crops, right? I mean, as you build that nutrition in the soil, that plant will naturally resist.
And
those,
how many times is it maybe not even a micronutrient? For example, if you're growing green beans in your garden, I learned this from an old master gardener years ago before I even knew what the reason was. But he said, when you plant the green beans, watch, and when they come up, when something starts chewing a hole in the leaf of the bean, put a tablespoon of Epsom salts in a gallon of water and put it in your pump-up sprayer and go out there and spray those beans. And he said, whatever chewing those holes in it will quit. But he said, now you start watching, because 3 to 4 weeks later, it's probably going to happen again. Well, you come back out there and do it again. And he said, every time you start seeing holes come in those leaves, come out there and spray those beans. You know what that bean is indicating? It's indicating we don't have enough magnesium in the bean.
That's what I was going to say, a deficiency in magnesium, right?
and the soil may have 20% magnesium in it, but the magnesium not getting into the plant. And that's what Dr. Albrecht would always say. Once you get above 12% magnesium, the plants can't get enough. They'll be deficient in magnesium even though we've got too much in the soil. Well,
and that's where the biological side comes in, correct? Because if it's in the soil, you still have to make it bioavailable for that plant to uptake, correct?
One way or another.
That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the other side of that is that just talking about a green bean? Well, what I'd tell you is when you spray your green beans, it's generally not going to take a gallon of that material, and you have your 1 or 2 rows of green beans or whatever sprayed. Spray it on your cucumbers or your sweet corn or your tomatoes and see if in 3 days they don't green up.
Yep.
Because we don't have enough magnesium there to produce the proper amount of chlorophyll. And once you start doing that, you'll see the others green up. I'm not saying it'll stop every bug from hurting you or whatever, but as far as to me, that's the indicator. And the other part is you spray magnesium foliar one time and you might see a green up, but does that mean you've put on enough to make any difference? Whenever those bugs keep coming back, you have to come back every 3 or 4 weeks. what that means is if you're going to get a benefit from a magnesium spray, it's probably going to have to be about every 3 or 4 weeks through the growing season, as long as you don't correct what the problem is.
Yeah. But once you correct that problem, like you said, using magnesium sulfate, usually something like that ahead of the crop, correct? Into the soils, balancing that soil out, and it's there, and the plant can uptake it. You have good microbial communities, the soil system's working properly, the life of the soil cycling into bioavailable forms, that plant can utilize it. And then you don't have to have that manual, the manual sprays.
And then taking it even a step further, let's take it into livestock applications. Last month in January, we had a consultant's training course in California, and one of the guys that was there is a consultant from Australia, but he raises sheep, and he got about probably 7,000 or 8,000 worth of acres of pasture, and he raises sheep on those pastures. Well, he started with us in 1996, and he had excess magnesium in the soils. And he had to feed supplemental magnesium to his sheep all the time. Well, when he finally got that magnesium, the last thing he got corrected was the magnesium levels down to below 12%. He said, in every pasture, when that magnesium dropped below 12%, the sheep quit eating the magnesium supplement. They stopped eating it. They didn't need it anymore. I just asked him that at this meeting again when all the consultants were there, and I said, I just want to confirm, have you tell the fellow. He said, that's right. When we got down below 12, he said, if it was 13 or 14 or higher, they were going to eat that magnesium supplement. But as soon as it got down between 10 and 12, they just quit eating. Now, if you drop below 10, it's going to happen again. They need it down that side too. Even worse.
That's interesting. That is. Well, no, yeah, let's move on now. Real world applications and troubleshooting. This is where, we talk to the audience now about how do we do this, in a real world type of a situation. And since you've basically consulted in over 70 countries, Neal, what is the most common soil mistake you see worldwide?
Well, we can look at that in two different ways. Overuse, generally nitrogen. Underuse, generally either calcium and or sulfur. But the failure to utilize calcium properly probably hurts more soils in the world than anything else. And why is that? Dr. Albrecht used to always point out calcium is the doorman to get every other nutrient into the plant. He said every other element has to go in over the back of the calcium ion to get into the plant. It was really interesting. Years and years ago, a fellow that in Canada that had just gotten his master's degree in agronomy from Guelph University came to one of our meetings, and we were talking about the importance of calcium, and we need calcium to get other nutrients in. And he said, the professor in his last advanced agronomy class, the first day he came into the class, he said, now, class, if they can't tell you how and they can't tell you why, you better not be doing it. They need to be able to tell you how and why. But he said, then close to the end of the year, one time he came in, he said, now, class, I can't tell you how and I can't tell you why. But until you get the calcium saturation in the soil solution around the root hairs to at least 60%, we don't get maximum uptake of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into the plant. Is that a good reason to say when we check a soil, the base saturation of calcium needs to be above 60%? Because how are you going to get it above 60% in the around the root hairs and keep it there if you don't have it in the soil?
That's a good point. And that's one of the first things you look at, I would take it, when you're looking and you're analyzing these reports.
The first thing we need to know in terms of how to evaluate a soil is how much is what amount of negative charge is there? What's the exchange capacity? Because until we know that, we don't know whether we got a cup or a bucket or a barrel. And then once you know that, now all of a sudden I use the illustration of coffee. Let's say that if you're drinking coffee, you like a teaspoon of sugar in your cup of coffee. All right. If we just got one cup, we need a teaspoon of sugar. That might be like a sandy soil. But then if we got a sandy loam soil, that might be like a bucket. So instead of one cup of coffee, how many cups of coffee we got in that 2-gallon bucket or 2.5-gallon bucket or whatever. Now we got to put 1 teaspoon of sugar for every equivalent of 1 cup of coffee in there to get the same saturation, the same sweetness. If it's a barrel, now it can take whopping amounts in order to do the same thing. So a real heavy clay soil, if we had to take care of all of it, thankfully most of the time most of it's taken care of, but it turns out to be a lot more costly for a heavy soil if we have excesses or severe deficiencies than it does for a sandy soil. So when we look at trying to balance out a soil and so forth, yeah, that's where we have to start. Now, once I know what the exchange capacity is, the base saturation percentage of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, or the next thing I like to look at, because that tells you what your soil structure is going to be or what you need to do to get the most from the soil. Now, we got to grow a crop this year in order to, farmer got to make a profit this year in order to stay in business. And so what we look at first is what is most limiting to the crop. But if you want to look at long-term success, what needs to be looked at is what is it that's limiting to the soil? Because once we correct that in the soil, like I've got clients that corrected their copper level in the 1970s. When I say corrected, got it to 2 or 5. I've got some guys that got it to 5 in the 1970s. They haven't had to put copper on again yet. The copper level is still
It's taken
above
on
5.
those hundredths of a pound or thousandths of a pound that it needs, and that's it. But the soil's balanced.
Yep.
It's balanced at that point.
And the guys that put it on back then, you know what they said? Man, copper sure is expensive, but it was a whole lot less expensive then than it is now.
Yeah, you're telling me. I was going to say, and now it's really expensive, right? It's a good investment, you could say, back then, right? You look at it in that form, and it's not only in crop investment, but in the actual investment of the copper as well.
And nutritional side of it for livestock and for us. I have a copy of an article from the Saturday Evening Post. A lot of people today might not even know what that magazine is, but that was, when I was growing up, that was one of the most popular magazines. And there's an article in 1949 where they're interviewing Dr. Albrecht about nutritional value of foods. And he said in 1949, if we don't start concentrating on supplying the micronutrients and so forth to food, we're going to get sicker and sicker and sicker. And you start reading what he was saying back then and what happened today, it has exactly happened because we haven't done what we need to do.
That's exactly right. And I was going to ask you about that too. We'll keep moving on, but I was going to ask you about that just to give a little piece on that. How do you feel about all the rare earth elements, right? We've talked about copper, boron, but what about the rest of really the periodic table? There's a lot of elements on there that they're found in different types of products and rock dusts and different things like that. Are those also elements that we really need to be looking at? Or how do you take, trace elements at their finest? I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. Those very fine traces into consideration, Neal.
Well, if for those who have a copy, an initial printing of Hands-On Agronomy, it has a blue cover on it rather than a green cover. In that blue one, there's a couple of chapters that are not in it that were written because Charles said later on, well, if you want to add some stuff and make some corrections or whatever, well, we added some chapters in the one that has the green color. And in the last couple of chapters, we addressed that. And what we found over the years is whatever you want to look at, whether it's a rock dust, a clay dust, a humate, any one of those types of materials, the soils where it works best are the soil that already have what Dr. Albrecht would say is the ideal levels for a soil. In other words, what we'd call a soil that's balanced in terms of the Albrecht system. And that's where they work the best. Now, Dr. Albrecht showed this. There are people who will say, oh, microbes are the answer. They're going to give you everything you need. Don't worry about otherwise. I agree that microbes are the answer, but you have to have the right environment for the microbes for them to do the best. Everybody needs what, the more ideal the circumstances, the better things are going to work for you. But Dr. Albrecht was actually hired at University of Missouri as a soil microbiologist. His first job at the University of Missouri was to teach farmers to use the proper rhizobium inoculant depending on which legume they were wanting to grow. So And he said, we developed those inoculants, and we'd have a farmer say he's going to grow alfalfa. Well, we'd have him put that inoculant on his seed, and he said, some farmer, oh, this is the greatest thing. This is exactly what I needed. Now, I couldn't imagine getting that kind of. And he said, then you'd have others that would use it and say, didn't seem to help me at all. Well, maybe that's the difference between a good observant farmer and one that's not. But he said, then you have farmers say, well, it helped on this part of the field, but it didn't help on this part of the field. So he said, we decided the answer was not just microbes. The answer was, why didn't the microbe work here as well as it did here? And he said, when we started looking, what we found was it always came back to the same saturations. When you got the ideal saturations, that's when it always worked the best. And I don't care what we talk about. When we start looking at adding those materials that have a whole lot more things in them, maybe it's minute amounts, but we don't even know how to measure how much we need, let alone how much it takes for the plants. And to me, that's where we have to stop using that target approach with a rifle and saying a shotgun approach, where we put on material that have a broad spectrum of all these things we don't know how to measure. And they don't generally turn out to be the limiting factor. And not all of them are necessarily limiting factors, but you don't find the ones that are until you take care of the ones that are big enough that you can measure them. So this is what I
and that makes and that makes a lot of sense. I was going to say, because the thing is if you have a limiting factor of potassium, whatever that may be, and you can, like you said, you can throw all the microbes you want, which you do have to have the microbial communities. But if you don't have the nutrition there for the plant to uptake or for the microbes to cycle or whatever that looks like when the plants are calling for them, what are you going to do? Yeah. There's nothing you can do with that. And then same thing with the rock dust and things like that. That is true. And there is no test that I'm aware of that measures all of the different trace elements to its fullest. You're talking some of these, in humates, in, rock powders, all those different things in clays. Not that I know of at this point. There
are some tests that can be done that just aren't in the mainstream as yet. But I think as time goes on, it's going to show up not measuring the nutrients, but measuring what's being produced by the nutrients. Like there's a study that's been done that I just recently saw, and they took organic wheat, conventional wheat, different types of varieties of wheat, Albrecht system grown wheat for organic and commercial, and they analyzed that wheat for as many compounds as they could find in it. And up until the recent past, they don't have machines that can do what's being done now. The most that they had ever identified was 1,700 compounds in wheat. Well, this new system identifies 4,000 different compounds. Some of them are only a letter or a number. They don't even know what they do or what they're good for or whatever. But now all of a sudden they can find, at least they can measure them. And by using all those comparisons and so forth, and even going to the bakeries and saying, okay, how does this wheat bake up in bread as compared to this one, as compared to this one? And all these things are being put together to evaluate the nutrient density of wheat. And
that's what I was going to say, the nutritional side of it, right? And that can be used in all crops at some point. And that's really where, we're always pushing like, man, this is really, producers should be paid on the nutrient density they're actually creating. Not necessarily just yield, but like how nutrient dense are those crops they're growing? What's in them? And that's a big thing that I think we're going to start seeing more and more of. And as producers and farmers are paid on that, it's going to want them to take care of their soil better, right? Balance it through the Albrecht methods, whatever that looks like, to provide the most nutrient dense food possible.
To me, that's where our trouble started. Back in the 1950s, I think it was 1955. I still have the manual, but it's a paperback published by the Council of Economic Advisors, advising the President of the United States. In one section of that, the Council of Economic Advisors advised the President, we need to adopt practices that lowers the price of food. It didn't say adopt practices that gives us good, nutritious food. It said to lower the price of food so the consumer doesn't have to spend so much on food. so he could spend more money on consumer items.
Yeah.
It wasn't a matter of looking at, well, okay, let's get a more economical food base so that, but make sure it's healthy. Because when you say let's get cheaper food, now all of a sudden the pressure is on to do cheaper food. Well, what that pressure on to a farmer? Well, how much am I going to have to reduce the fertilizer bill or whatever I need in order to still be able to sell? Because the emphasis was on bulk and not on quality. And I think that's where we really got off track, and we've just gotten worse and worse off track because people aren't looking for what keeps us healthy. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of people that'll say, oh, it doesn't matter. That's not what really makes us healthy is for what we eat. It's just, eat what you want to and then take a pill because we're going to be sick anyway. Well, we are now.
Yeah, we are. Our soils are sick. We're sick. Everything's sick, it seems like,
Yep. And the closer we pay attention to the nutritional values of the soil, the better the nutritional values are going to be. And this is actually starting to be shown now that we have somebody concentrating on nutrient-dense foods. But nutrient-dense foods don't just come. You got to put the right nutrients there to get it.
That's right. And that comes back to what we were talking about through these tests and things like that, balancing soils, making sure those little pieces of the puzzle are all there. So when the plants call for them and they need them, they're ready to go, Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the cost. Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's an old saying, you can't manage what you can't measure.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. The cost of inaction. Yep. Let's discuss the ROI of soil balancing, right? Is it more expensive to fix the soil or keep propping up a failing system? And I think you mentioned this a little bit, right? It's wiser to get those levels up of copper or whatever that is because your yields are going to follow.
There are a number of things we could talk about there that sort of are a factor in it. But the big factor comes down to something like this. I had a client, and the father was farming for years, and he was spending the money to get the soil balanced out and so forth. Then he retired, and his son started to do the farming, and he still used our program, was putting on everything, but the bank they were using sold out to a larger bank. And when they sold out to the larger bank, he got called in, and the fellow that had to do with ag loan said, well, you gotta reduce your amount of money you're spending for fertilizer. You're spending way more than everybody else. And he said, well, what about my return on investment? He said, well, yeah, it is. You have the best return on investment. He said, and that's how I get it. I have to spend that money on fertilizer in order to get the yield so that I can get that return on investment. Well, long story short, they approved his loan. The next year, that bank sold out to another bank, same story. They called him in and said, you got to reduce your cost of fertilizer. You're spending way more than other farmers. He got his loan again after he showed them what was happening. That happened 3 times in a matter of about 5 years. And he said, I could still come in and show them, well, look, all right, I may spend a lot more on fertilizer, but I still make a better return on investment. Whenever you're putting what you need there, that's going to pay off. But you can't convince most people of that. They have to learn it for themselves.
Yeah, well, and banks, they're the best ones to explain it to because they love return on investment, right? They get it.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, they're the good ones to tell it to. But that's exactly right. So, and that's where the return on investment comes. You balance your soil, you grow more yield, you grow healthier crops, other inputs. It costs you less, for sprays, pesticides, fungicides, you name it. And the money does go back into the right person's pocket, which is the producer, the farmer, the rancher, the guys that are sticking their necks out there to grow these crops, to feed us, to feed animals. It's a big deal. Let's do a transitioning question. If a grower has dead soil or soils, I don't want to say dead because that's the biological side, which you and I discussed. It's a very important piece of that puzzle. If you don't have any life in your soil, you're in trouble as well. But say, where do they start? Like with your method, if it's a dead soil or low, where do they start? And what is the first domino that needs to fall?
Well, what I would say is we need to get back to those 4 issues of life itself: shelter, food, water, and air. And the one we'll normally find that's most limiting is either air or water.
Okay.
So if you're a clay soil, too much water, not enough air. What do we do in order to increase the porosity of that soil? Now, that's for long term, and that has to do with getting the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium in the right percentages.
Sure.
For sand, it's the opposite. Too much air, not enough water. So there we start to try to see, well, okay, how can we use magnesium, potassium, and sodium, get them there in the right amounts for what we need to grow the plants, but at the same time, it just reduces the pore space so that now we don't have so much air in comparison to the amount of water we want to hold. And sands need help holding water. Clay soils need help getting enough air.
Perfect.
So to me,
those
that's
are the
the
first
place.
things
If
that you
you're
would
looking
look
long
at.
range, that's where you start.
Perfect. Balancing those ratios out, and that's the long term. That's the first step. Perfect. We're gonna head into some rapid fire questions for you, Neal, and then we'll wrap this thing up. But what is the most misunderstood element in agriculture?
The most misunderstood?
Yes.
Most misunderstood element in agriculture, I still say it's calcium.
Calcium. Calcium's
Because
king.
people just don't realize, they start looking at pH and they don't really look at what calcium is doing or not doing. If I had to pick one, I'd say it's calcium. And number two, right behind it, would be sulfur.
Calcium and sulfur. All right. One book besides your own every grower should read.
Soil Fertility and Animal Health by William A. Albrecht. That's the
Perfect.
Albrecht Papers, Volume 2. It's the original book was Soil Fertility and Animal Health. The original source was a series of articles done for the American Angus Journal in the 1930s, and it's still just as relevant today as it was in the 1930s. Soil Fertility and Animal Health by William A. Albrecht. You can get it at the
Perfect.
library under that title if you really don't want to buy a copy, but I tell you, there'll probably be some things you want to underline and remember if you're somebody that's really looking for studying soil.
Absolutely. Perfect. What is one thing a gardener or farmer should stop doing immediately?
Putting on fertilizer without knowing what the nutrient levels are in your garden.
Perfect.
Just guessing doesn't work well, because if you are counting on that garden to supply good, nutritious food from you, if you put on too much of one thing, you're going to cause a problem with something else. So First of all, what I'd say is, you can grow good plants without, without doing a soil test maybe, and they look good, but are we really getting what we need from them?
Perfect. So do that soil test. Know the numbers before you go dumping on fertilizer.
That's right. At least it'll
Perfect.
keep you from making a great big mistake.
That's right. That's right. So what are you excited about in the next 10 years of agronomy, would you say, Neal?
What I'm excited about most is being able to apply what each different soil in the same field shows is needed. And so that has to do with GPS. And I feel like GPS is the best thing that's happened for agriculture since learning Dr. Albrecht's program. But it's like everything else, we've got to use it properly. And right now, there's so many different ways people are doing. But what I'm looking at is, when is the day we can say, all right, this part of the field needs no lime at all, this part of the field, and it's here. We have people that are doing it, but most of agriculture is not, because they only look at pH still yet. We've got to start using our science. And the science is there. It's just using it.
Fair. That's fair. If you don't mind, where can we find Kinsey Agricultural Services and information on your courses, if you would, Neal? Share that with our audience.
As far as finding the courses that we actually sponsor, go to our website, www.kinseyag.com, KINSEYAG.com. But you'll find that there are very few on there anymore, because most of the programs that are conducted are sponsored by companies or groups or whatever. And we'll say, if you will send us the information soon enough so we can get it on our website, we'll be glad to publish it on there. But most of them don't send us anything until right at the last minute. So many of the meetings that we have are not advertise. And some actually will say, we don't want it advertised. We already are full. We've got, we've got as many as we can hold. So we don't want you to advertise it. So, but as far as anything that we sponsor, it will always be on there.
KinseyAgServices.com. That's where you're going to go.
Just Kinsey Ag. Just KINSEYAG.com. KinseyAg.com. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, and I just want to wrap up. I definitely thank you so much, Neal, for your wisdom, just for sharing everything that you've learned over the time that you've been working with soil. From your time with Dr. Albrecht to today, and everything you've learned, you've shared it with our audience, and we appreciate that. It's the truth. It really does help the future, seeing things like this. We're going to push this out to the world, to all of our audience. If you would, like us, follow us, subscribe to our channel, all of those different things, our YouTube, so we can definitely get this pushed out as a podcast. If you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of those types, to our audience, if you guys would definitely follow this podcast, learn more from Neal and from some of these titans that we've brought on here that really have shaped the agricultural community and the future of what we're dealing with. I would appreciate that. But again, we just thank you so much, Neal, for your time. We thank you for your wisdom and just for helping us learn more and our audience. We'll pass this forward and make sure as many people as possible know.
Thank you for having me and the opportunity to make those comments. I'd like to help people as much as we possibly can.